Hi everybody, welcome to our seminar today. We'll just give one more minute, let people join the call. We've had a tremendous reception to our invitation to this session on disability in the justice system, so we've got expecting quite a lot of people. I've got this unenviable job of talking to nobody at the beginning of the meeting, so I've prepared some jokes. Lamentable. I'm assuming that some people are joining from some pretty wet country around Australia. If shout out to those in country New South Wales and country Victoria who are doing it pretty difficult time at the moment. It's still grey and wet in Sydney, but certainly nothing like what you hear is going on in the regions. Okay, so it's 3:02, so we might kick off. So my name is Jackie Fitzgerald. I'm the Executive Director at the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. So thanks so much for joining us today. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands that myself and our presenters and you, the audience, are joining us from today, and recognise the ongoing connection that First Nations people have to culture and country. So I'm joining you today from the land of the Barramadigal people on the Darug Nation, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all the Aboriginal people joining us today. So today we're going to hear about some really groundbreaking research that's just newly been completed at the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. We're going to hear from Suzanne Poynton and Stewart Boiteux, who are two senior researchers at BOCSAR, who've going to share the results of a new linkage study that looks at disability among people in contact with the criminal justice system. And for those of you who have worked in this area for a while, you'd recognise that this has frankly been acknowledged but also embarrassing omission from our body of knowledge about the justice system. We just really haven't had any rich disability data, apart from occasional studies, but really nothing like what we need to progress redressing the balance for those people, for that vulnerable group. So we're going to hand over to Stewart, who's going to talk to us about this new study, and then follow that up by by Suzanne later in the session, who's going to do a deep dive into the patterns and risk factors for people who are victims of crime and how that relates to disability. So join me in welcoming Stewart Boiteux to the floor. So he's going to talk about trends and rates of victimisation and defending for people with disability in New South Wales, and also give an overview about the study that's led to the generation of this knowledge. So welcome, Stewart, and looking forward to hearing from you today.
Great, thanks, Jackie. So before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land I'm speaking from today, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal people joining us this afternoon. So today I'm going to be discussing some work that we've been doing looking at the interaction that people with disability have with the criminal justice system in New South Wales. So these results have been produced as part of a wider National Disability Data Asset pilot study, which I'm going to discuss. And then I'm going to go into presenting some results from one of our publications, looking at trends in the rates of offending and victimisation experienced both by people with disability and by the total New South Wales population. So the presentation is going to be structured in 4 parts. First, I'm going to give a little bit of context on what the National Disability Data Asset pilot is, how we identified people with disability, and then I'll move on to discussing 2 sets of results from the trend publication, the first being the offending rates and the second being victimisation rates. So the National Disability Data Asset pilot is a national project linking and working with data specific to people with disability, with the aim of demonstrating the utility of such a dataset for development as an ongoing data asset available to researchers. It's also hoped that work from this project can produce some insights which are helpful to both the new National Disability Strategy and the Disability Royal Commission. So overall, the project aims to develop a more comprehensive understanding of the needs and service usage patterns of people with disability than has previously been available. So the pilot was comprised of 5 test cases exploring issues related to justice, education, early childhood supports, mental health, and data quality. Our test case, the justice test case, was focused on exploring the interaction that people with disability have with the criminal justice system in New South Wales. So the reason that this is important, as Jackie said, is that there's been this recurring issue raised in disability research where there's a lack of information about people with disability interacting with mainstream services, usually due to sort of limitations of administrative data collected in practice. So in the New South Wales criminal justice system, although we have surveys which suggest that people with disability are strongly overrepresented in custody, we actually have little information about how many people are in contact with other areas of the criminal justice system and how they experience this interaction. So to answer these questions, we focused on people over the age of 10 who lived in New South Wales between 2009 and 2018. By linking a larger number of datasets, we were able to access a variety of service usage information for people who were in contact with the criminal justice system or a set of core disability services. So overall, this created a very large population level dataset of 2.8 million people, including around 700,000 in contact with disability services and 2.3 million in contact with the criminal justice system as a victim or offender. And we use this information to answer questions about specific types of criminal justice system contact experienced by people with disability. So I want to quickly acknowledge the amazing team of people who contributed their time and energy into making this project possible, including Tracy Painting and Mark Ramsey for their amazing work preparing criminal justice datasets for the test case. I also want to specifically recognise the contributions of Julian Troller, Philip Snoyman and Eileen Baldry, who provided really valuable feedback on our work throughout the project. But most importantly, I want to focus on the contribution of our Aboriginal Perspectives Expert Advisory Panel. So a really unique feature of our test case was a collaboration with this panel of experts who were embedded in our work throughout the project and who contributed valuable insights around how Aboriginal people and those with disability interact with different government service systems, and this really helped shape the results of the test case. So throughout the presentation and in later presentation, we're going to use the term Aboriginal to refer to Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islanders, and people who identify as both an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person. So specifically, the panel reiterated and helped to contextualise the lack of existing research in Australia concerning Aboriginal people with disability, which has been a focus of the Disability Royal Commission. So, for example, in discussion with the panel, we were able to better understand issues impacting the identification of Aboriginal people in individual data collections and service systems, and how this might differentially impact Aboriginal people with disability. So these issues might be things like underrepresentation of Aboriginal people due to how they're identified by service providers in practice, or it could also be a possible unwillingness of Aboriginal people to identify to certain service providers or in certain contexts. So in collaboration with the team, we were able to overcome these limitations by implementing a linked dataset approach to identifying Aboriginal people, which has been commonly used in other contexts, known as the multi-stage median algorithm. So broadly, this measure was chosen as it's able to overcome data limitations of individual datasets and service systems while reducing concerns related to data linkage errors. So what this means in practice is that we can be more confident about the factors such as an unwillingness to identify as an Aboriginal person in a criminal justice setting. We can be more confident that these aren't driving our results. So I'm going to now move on to how we identified people with disability. So the NDDA, or National Disability Data Asset Justice Test Case dataset, is a large population level linked dataset composed of information from more or less 14 service systems. So these include 3 main disability datasets in purple, which include information on disability services provided at both the state and the Commonwealth level. The first is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. The second is an AIHW National Minimum Dataset, which aggregates information on state-based specialist disability services. And the third is the Department of Social Services Domino Dataset, which includes information on social service provision, including the disability support pension. So Inclusion in these first two datasets or receiving the disability support pension in the third makes up the core population of people with disability in our results. So when we're talking about people with disability, it's people in contact with these services. Similarly, on the justice side, there are three main sources of information which make up the population of people in contact with the criminal justice system. These include BOCSAR's reoffending database, a victims of crime extract developed from the New South Wales Police COPS database, and lastly, episodes in custody with corrective services. The remaining datasets provide detailed information on additional service contacts across the domains of health, housing, child protection, and homelessness. So although the disability datasets provide strong information regarding people with disability, many people with disability may not be in contact with these services. So in an attempt to account for this, we also developed a service-based disability indicator, which allows for a larger number of people with disability to be identified in the administrative datasets. So broadly, this works by drawing on additional information from other datasets. Specifically, it includes additional disability measures recorded in hospitalisation admitted patient care episodes, social housing, homelessness services, the MBS, and some additional information from Commonwealth Social Services. By taking in a larger set of information, the expanded service-based indicator can be used to assess the proportion of people in contact with the justice system who have a disability using a much wider lens. So it's important to note throughout our results that we use an ever-identified measure of disability. So what this means is that we recognise a person as being a person with disability, regardless of when they were in contact with disability services, as long as it was between 2009 and 2018. So what this means is that some people with disability may have only been in contact with disability services for the first time after their contact with the criminal justice system. But what we found in practice is that the majority of people with disability had their contact or their first contact with disability services prior to their first contact with the criminal justice system. So using all of this disability information, disability was broadly categorised into three main types: cognitive, physical, and psychosocial disability. I've included some examples of underlying conditions and circumstances and their disability categorisations here. So, for example, both intellectual disability and autism fall under cognitive disability. Some conditions fall under multiple categories, such as fetal alcohol syndrome, which has been categorised as both a cognitive and physical disability. Physical disability also contains categories such as visual impairment and hearing loss. And then some prominent psychosocial disabilities might include schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, and major depressive illness. So if we take that original Venn diagram, we're able to identify 230,000 people with disability who were in contact with the criminal justice system. And using that more inclusive service-based disability measure, we're able to identify an additional 132,000 people with disability interacting with the criminal justice system. So to date, our test case has produced 4 BOCSAR reports, with 2 already published that we're going to be discussing today. For the remainder of the presentation, I'll be discussing the first of these, which looks at trends in the rates of offending and victimisation experienced by people with disability and those experienced by the total population. So importantly, this is the first study to examine rates of offending and victimisation for people with disability in New South Wales, with comparison to the total New South Wales population. So by doing so, the research develops a baseline of evidence about the extent to which people with disability interact with the criminal justice system that can be used to inform future research, policy, and service design to improve outcomes for people with disability, their families, and guardians. So for this paper, we identify people with disability using that core measure of those in contact with the disability support pension, the National Minimum Dataset, or the NDIS. We also incorporate New South Wales population estimates from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So using this information, we calculate age and sex standardised rates of offending and victimisation, and then compare these trends in offending rates and victimisation rates between people with disability and the general population over the decade between 2009 and 2018. So as an example of underlying population differences, which really emphasise the importance of using age and sex standardisation in this context, I've plotted here some population pyramids for people with disability, offenders, and the total population in New South Wales on the right. So in light purple are the proportion of underlying populations in each age group who are men, and on the right, in dark purple, are equivalent proportions for women. So, as is pretty clear in this first figure, people with disability were more likely to be older and slightly more likely to be male than female. From the second figure, offenders are much more often younger and male. And then in the final figure, it's clear that the New South Wales population follows a much more uniform age structure with closer to equal proportions of men and women in each age bracket. So we standardise results to this population structure, which allows us to control for the effects of age and sex characteristics related to both disability and criminal justice contact, so that we can get a better understanding of the influence of disability on criminal justice contact outside of those influences of age and sex, which also might vary between years, particularly when we're looking at trends over a decade. So rates that follow have this age and sex standardisation applied, but if people are interested in the crude unadjusted rates, these are also available in our publication online. So to keep to time, I'm going to move through some of these charts quite quickly with the intention to show an array of results, but then I'll bring it all back together at the end to discuss everything a bit more holistically. So first we're going to look at rates of offending. This is measured as finalised court appearances, regardless of outcome, or for younger offenders, it may be a police caution or a youth justice conference. So here I've plotted the standardised rates of any offending contact for people with disability in purple and the total New South Wales population with a grey dashed line. This is interpreted as the rate of people in each group who offend per 100,000 people. So for example, between 2009 and 2010, people with disability had an adjusted offending rate averaging around 5,000 per 100,000 people with disability. From 2009 to 2018, offending rates reduced by around 18%, and this trend was fairly parallel between people with and without with disability and with the total population, which showed no statistically significant divergence between 2009 and 2018. So notably, the rates of offending with any offence type here were around 2.5 times higher for people with disability than those in the total New South Wales population. So next I'm going to move on to looking at property offending. So similarly to offending with any offence type, rates of property offending reduced by about 23% between 2009 and 2018. Again, these were fairly parallel between people with disability and the total New South Wales population, which showed no statistically significant divergence between 2009 and 2018. Notably again, the rates of offending with a property offence type were around 3.3 times higher for people with disability than those of the total New South Wales population. Next, we'll look at violent offending. So rates of violent offending were stable, and again, trends were fairly parallel between people with disability and the total New South Wales population. Notably, the rates of offending with a violent offence type were similar to property offending, around 3.2 times higher for people with disability than in the total New South Wales population. And then finally, we'll take a quick look at domestic violence related offending. So unlike other offence types, rates of domestic violence offending increased significantly by nearly 70% between 2009 and 2018. So while it appears that the rates of domestic violence related offending have trended away from each other between 2009 and 2018, this divergence in trends between people with disability and the total New South Wales population is actually not statistically significant. As with violent offences, rates of offending with a domestic violence related offence were around 3.2 times higher for people with disability than those of the total New South Wales population. Now we'll move on to looking at some rates of victimisation as measured by incidents of victimisation reported to the New South Wales Police. So rates of crime victimisation reduced by around 18% between 2009 and 2018. As with many of the offending trends, victimisation rate trends were fairly parallel between people with and without disability. As with offending, rates of crime victimisation were around 1.6 times higher for people with disability than those of the total New South Wales population. So now, as we did with offending, I'll take a quick look at property crime. So mirroring the trend in all crime victimisation, rates of property crime victimisation reduced by around 18% between 2009 and 2018. Unlike other trends displayed so far, property crime victimisation rate trends do show a statistically significant difference or divergence between 2009 and 2018. So beginning in around 2009, rates were quite close together. However, these diverged, forming what seems like a parallel trend from 2011. Rates of property crime victimisation were much closer to those of the total population. However, they were still 1.2 times higher on average over the study period for people with disability. So next we'll look at rates of victimisation for incidents of violent crime. So rates of violent crime victimisation reduced by about 17% between 2009 and 2018. These trends were again fairly parallel between people with disability and the total New South Wales population. However, rates of violent crime victimisation were around 2.6 times higher for people with disability than those of the total New South Wales population. And then finally, we'll look at rates of crime victimisation with domestic violence related incidents. So, unlike other crime victimisation trends, rates of domestic violence crime victimisation were stationary between 2009 and 2018. Trends were again fairly parallel between people with disability and the total New South Wales population between 2009 and 2018. So rates were significantly different. They're around 2.6 times higher for people with disability than the total New South Wales population. So now that we're through all of that, I'll just go through a quick summary, bringing all these results together. So the first thing to discuss is that between 2009 and 2018, offending and victimisation rates were fairly parallel, and they didn't trend differently between people with disability and the total population. So this is interesting for two reasons. Firstly, as the trends move in parallel, it's likely that the drivers behind criminal justice contact, which influence total population trends in offending and victimisation, are acting similarly for people with disability and the total population. Secondly, while programs and policies targeting people with disability operate across New South Wales, at such an aggregated level, looking at all disability across the entire state, we're not able to observe deviations from longer-term population trends in the offending and victimisation contact for people with disability. So the second thing to notice is that across all offence and victimisation types examined, people with disability had significantly higher rates of criminal justice contact than those experienced in the general population. So this is most notable here in the rates of violent and property offending, which are more than 3 times higher for people with disability. Focusing on victimisation contact, people with disability were more than 2.5 times more likely to be a victim of violent or domestic violence related crime in the study period. Victimisation rates were most similar for victims of property crime, where the rate of victimisation experienced by people with disability was only 1.2 times higher than that in the general population. So interestingly here, while population offending rates for domestic violence offending are trending upwards, trends in the rate of domestic violence victimisation were stable over the period. So while multiple factors are at play forming these trends, this is most likely due to an increase in police action rates in domestic violence related offences over the period. And if anyone is really interested in these domestic violence trends, we have a great paper available on this on our website by Karen Freeman on the topic. Finally, while I don't have other offending and victimisation rates in the presentation, there are other crime categories considered in the main paper, and these similar rates and trends are available for these other offence and victimisation types in the publication on BOCSAR's website. So, as is what is probably the first population estimate of criminal justice contact experienced by people with disability using a consistent measure of disability to look at both victimisation and offending, and including a comparison with the total population. This report provides a really strong evidence base to support future policy development and the reports produced throughout the Disability Royal Commission. So both the report and the construction of the National Disability Data Asset Pilot Justice Test Case dataset also demonstrate that data linkage is a viable solution to addressing a lot of the long-standing shortage in disability-specific research in Australia. Ultimately, by making this kind of pre-linked disability-specific information available to researchers, it really removes a lot of the administrative and cost hurdles to engaging in this kind of research, and having it available would increase the sector's capacity to evaluate and monitor policies and programs designed to better support people with disability. So without readily accessible data such as this, policy and program practitioners will likely continue to develop strategies without timely feedback on what works, and without the progress of many policy objectives could remain pretty well unmeasured. So I think it would be a really good, case just to move forwards with this kind of a data asset for disability policy and research. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Stewart. That was excellent. So we do have quite a few questions, and I was totally negligent in my chairing duties, and I forgot to invite people to put their questions in, but luckily some people might have been in this roundabout before and they know to do that. But by all means, put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to those that we can. They sometimes take a little while to come through, so please put them in early if you can. So Stewart, just a question here, a good one. We know that people with disability are likely to also be economically disadvantaged, and we also know that people who have economic disadvantage are more likely to be victims and offenders in crime. Did you include any controls for those other factors that we know are associated with either offending or victimisation?
So in this raw trends paper that I've just presented, we weren't able to include these sort of other influences that might be affecting offending between people with disability and in the population. However, we have produced 3 other publications which do take into account things like socioeconomic differences. In one of them, it looks at differences in child protection contact. For victims of crime, we look at things like regionality and remoteness. So these are definitely things we have considered in the other papers, but I think this main trends paper was really just about producing that sort of baseline difference to provide some evidence for, the experiences of people with disability.
Can you give us a little preview of the results in the coming paper?
So I think even after controlling for things like socioeconomic background and remoteness and a lot of other things sort of related to offending, there definitely is still an overrepresentation of people with disability, both as victims of crime and offenders.
Great, yeah. That's really interesting, isn't it? Okay, another question here. You raised the notion of 3 disability types that were considered in the study, but we didn't hear results for those 3 disability types. So I think it was cognitive, psychosocial, and physical. Were the results different at all for those different disability types?
So again, we didn't present this information in the trends paper, but we do have the several other publications that consider this. What is really interesting is we do find differences between the different disability types in levels of crime victimisation and offending. Specifically, we also find differences sort of at the intersect of these different disability types. So if someone has a cognitive and psychosocial disability, they might be at a higher risk of offending contact and victimisation than some people with just a single disability type. So there's definitely differences and interactions going on between different disability types.
Okay, fantastic. Another question here. So this is, you might have to go out on a limb here, Stewart, but what do you think are the reasons behind the higher rates of offending and victimisation amongst people with disability? And I don't know if you wanted to make mention of the fact that the overrepresentation amongst offenders seems to be higher than it does amongst victims. So that's I guess possibly an unexpected result there. But do you have any thoughts about causation or explanations?
So there've been several sort of ideas put out in research to date. A lot of the disability specific research, which really boil down to sort of 2 non-competing theories. So one of them, as you said, is that a lot of people with disability are known to experience a lot of other socioeconomic and other disadvantages, and that we know these things are related to, say, higher levels of offending and victimisation. So definitely that's playing a role to some extent. And then the other sort of non-competing theory is, it's called the differential treatment hypothesis. And it's just the idea that, say, a lot of the systems that we have set up are not sort of built to recognise and respond to people with disability in sort of a fair or equal way, and that sort of just mainstream operation of a lot of these services may actually be disadvantaging people with disability in practice. So in the case of, say, the difference between offending and victimisation, it's been suggested in some past research that for things like cognitive disability, people might experience differences in executive functioning, and that this might sort of relate to behaviours that might be interpreted or misinterpreted as offending behaviour. And it might lead to higher rates of contact, or it could also be for different offence types if things like breaches of orders. So if orders are maybe not being explained in a very accessible way, that this might lead to higher rates of offending by breaching those sorts of orders. So I think it's kind of hard to know exactly why there's a difference as well between offending and victimisation, but it's also really important to notice that we know that victimisation rates reported to the New South Wales Police are likely somewhat underestimated. And so there might also be some reporting differences between people with and without disability in their propensity to sort of report victimisation to the police. So that could also be driving some of the differences there.
Great, thanks so much, Stuart. We're going to have to leave it there so that we have enough time for a second part of our presentation, but people can give virtual silent thanks to Stuart for his presentation today. And I'll move on to to Suzanne. So really welcome Suzanne Poynton, Director of Research and Evaluation at BOCSAR. So she's going to be talking in more depth about the victimisation results, and in particular repeat victimisation. And I'm sure she'll mention that this victimisation lens that we've been able to include is really quite unique, and one of the first times this has really been included in a study of this site. So it's quite exciting. Over to you, Suzanne.
Thanks, Jackie. And thanks to everyone for joining our online seminar series today. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the Barramadigal people of the Darug Nation, on whose land I'm speaking from today, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal colleagues that are on the call with us this afternoon. So today, as Jackie said, I'll be presenting the results from a second paper that BOCSAR has published from the work that was undertaken as part of the NDDA pilot justice test case. And this particular paper focuses more deeply on people with disabilities' experiences of crime as a victim. Like Stuart, I'd like to recognise that there was a much wider project team that contributed to the justice test case, and everyone there listed made a contribution. But in particular, I'd like to acknowledge Claire Ringland, who, previously of BOCSAR, who's now with the Department of Education, who is the lead author on the paper that I'm presenting today, and who is critical to the development of the data set and also the analysis that I'm presenting. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the light back on. Hopefully that's worked. Okay, so Stuart's already given you a bit of a background on what the National Disability Data Asset Pilot involved and what are some of the key objectives of the Justice Test Case. So I'm just going to jump into the method that we use to identify people for this particular paper, and then I'm going to present some results for two of our primary research questions. Firstly, what proportion of people with disability in New South Wales are victims of crime? And secondly, what proportion of victims of crime have a disability? So there were two cohorts of interest for this particular study. The first is the disability cohort, which Stuart referred to, and this is all people in contact with at least one core disability service or support between 2009 and 2018, and includes the NDIS, state-based disability services, and people that were in receipt of the disability support pension. The second cohort of interest in this study was the victim cohort. So this is all people who were recorded as a victim of crime reported to the New South Wales Police Force. So these data came from the New South Wales Computerised Operational Policing System, otherwise known as COPS. And for this study, we included just incidents that occurred between 2014 and 2018. So the most recent 5-year period that was available in the Justice Test Case dataset. Now, there were several research questions that we're interested in answering for each of these cohorts. For the disability cohort, we're wanting to estimate the prevalence of victimisation amongst people with disability, but also look at factors that might be associated with an increased risk of victimisation for people with a disability. For the victim cohort, we wanted to estimate what proportion of victims of crime in New South Wales have a disability. But we also wanted to look at the characteristics of incidents involving people with disability and how they compare with those where the victim does not have a disability. And this included things like whether incidents involving people with disability were more or less likely to result in a person being proceeded against by police. Or we also wanted to look at whether people with disability are more or less likely to experience repeat victimisation than people with no disability identified, particularly taking into account all of the other risk factors that Stewart was alluding to before. Now, one concern for us was that the identification of people with disability using just the disability cohort definition potentially underestimates the prevalence of disability for the victim population. This is because some people with disability won't access disability-specific services and supports, and some won't be eligible for those services and supports. So to address this limitation, we also used a broader range of data collections to identify an additional group of individuals in the disability who are likely to have a disability but who did not appear in the disability-specific data sources. The broader data sets that we used for this purpose were some additional codes from Domino, hospitalisation data, MBS data, and also housing and homelessness data. So individuals that were identified as having a disability through these sources alone are referred to in the remainder of my presentation as the other disability identifier group. Because of the way the Justice Test Case was constructed, this information was only useful for identifying additional people with disability amongst those who have a victim contact. So turning firstly to question 1, what proportion of people with disability are victims of crime? So we go back to the Venn diagram that Stewart presented, and this time we're focusing on the left-hand side of your screen, and that is the disability cohort. So there was 542,388 people who are receiving disability supports or services between 2009 and 2018 that resided in New South Wales. And of these people, 92,370 were recorded as a victim in one or more incidents between 2014 and 2019. So to answer that first question, we estimated around about 17% of people with disability are victims of crime in New South Wales. Now that's overall. So overall, 17% of people with disability recorded as a victim of any type of crime, but a much smaller proportion experienced violent crime and DV-related crime. So around about 7% of people with disability experienced a violent crime in the period that we looked at, and 4% experienced a DV-related crime. Now, the proportion of people who experienced a criminal incident also varied by disability type. This goes to Jackie's question that she raised previously. So it ranged from 17% of those with a physical disability to 20% of those with a psychosocial disability. But it is notable that nearly 1 in 10 people with a cognitive or psychosocial disability were victims of a violent crime. Now, most people with disability who are victims of crime experienced only one episode. Almost 3 in 5 recorded just one incident over the 5 years. However, multiple episodes were recorded for many DV victims. So of those who experienced a DV-related incident, over 1/4 had 3 or more recorded incidents, and 11% had 5 or more recorded incidents during the 5-year period. We also found that Aboriginal women with disability had much higher rates of victimisation, with 34% being recorded as a victim of any crime, 18% as a victim of a violent crime, and 19% as a victim of a domestic violence related crime. Aboriginal males with disability also had higher rates of victimisation than non-Aboriginal males and non-Aboriginal females. 29% were victims of any crime, 15% victims of a violent crime, and 9% a victim of a DV-related crime. Rates of victimisation also tended to decrease with increasing age, particularly for violent and domestic violence-related crimes. Of those aged between 15 and 19, 22% were recorded as victims of any crime during the 5-year period, 13% were recorded as a victim of a violent incident, and 8% a victim of a DV-related crime. In comparison, of those aged 60 to 69, 10% were recorded as victims of crime during the period, 2% were recorded in relation to violent incidents, and 1% were victims of DV-related crime. Moving on to the second question, here we're interested in what proportion of victims of crime have a disability. So to answer this question, we go to the right-hand side of the Venn diagram on your screen, and that is the victim cohort. So there was 890,138 people who were recorded as a victim of at least one crime in New South Wales between 2014 and 2019. And 96,112 of these people were receiving disability services and supports. So we estimate that 11% of all victims of crime in New South Wales have a disability. However, as mentioned earlier, for the victim cohort, we were able to use some additional data to get a better estimate of the prevalence of disability among victims of crime. Using this data from these other data sources, we identified an additional 7% of victims as having a disability. Therefore, we estimate that between 11 and 18% of all victims of crime were people with disability. We also found that incidents involving people with disability were more often violent and DV related. As seen from the graph, between 12 and 28% of victims of violent crime were identified as having a disability, and up to 32% of victims of domestic violence related crime were identified with disability. We also examined characteristics of victims and incidents according to whether the incident involved a victim identified as having a disability. In general, incident characteristics were basically similar regardless of the disability status of the victims. However, as I mentioned previously, we did find that incidents involving people with disability were more often violent and DV related, while incidents involving people with no known disability were more commonly property incidents such as steal from motor vehicle and fraud. In part reflecting these incident types, a greater proportion of incidents involving people with disability as victims had alcohol recorded as an associated factor. A greater proportion took place on residential premises and had a person of interest identified. Similarly, victims residing in regional areas and areas of greater socioeconomic disadvantage were more likely to have a disability than victims in major cities and less disadvantaged areas. Again, we see an overrepresentation of Aboriginal people. A significantly higher proportion of Aboriginal victims were identified with disability. In almost a half of incidents that involved a victim who was an Aboriginal person, the victim was identified as being a person with disability. This compares with 23% of incidents where the victim was a non-Aboriginal person. These high rates of disability were evident amongst both male Aboriginal victims and female Aboriginal victims. We also examined the likelihood of a person being proceeded against by police for a violent incident that involved a victim with disability. Overall, 38% of incidents involving people in the disability cohort, 42% involving other people with a disability, and 43% of those with no disability identified resulted in a person being proceeded against by police. But percentages were lower for violent incidents involving victims with cognitive disabilities, with police proceeding against someone in only around 1/3 of these incidents. Also shown on this slide is the output from a regression model, where the outcome is the likelihood of police proceeding against a POI in relation to the index event or a person of interest. And disability type are explanatory variables in the model, along with a large number of other factors that may be related to the likelihood of police taking action. What you have in the figure is both the coefficient estimates and the confidence intervals, and relationships are expressed as adjusted odds ratios. So what you need to know is that if the adjusted odds ratio is greater than 1, that is, it falls to the right-hand side of the dotted line on the figure, then that means that the person of interest in relation to that incident was more likely to be proceeded against if the victim had that particular characteristic. And if the adjusted odds ratio is less than 1, that is, it's to the left-hand side of the dotted line, then they were less likely to be proceeded against by police. So basically, this confirms that persons of interest are significantly less likely to be proceeded against in violent incidents involving people with a disability, even after we take all of the other relevant factors into account that might increase or decrease the risk of police taking action. The odds of a person being proceeded against for a violent incident involving a person with disability were 17% lower than for a violent incident involving a person without disability. Police action rates were particularly low where the victim had both a cognitive and a physical disability. Next, we examined factors associated with repeat victimisation within 12 months, again focusing on violent crime and on any differences between victims identified with disability and those not known to have a disability. So overall, 20% or 1 in 5 of victims of violent incidents experienced another violent incident within 12 months. And again, percentages varied for those with and without disability, with 18% of those with no disability identified, 22% of those in the disability cohort, and 25% of those otherwise identified as having a disability experiencing another violent incident within 12 months. Rates of violent re-victimisation were highest for those with both cognitive and psychosocial disabilities at around 26%. Also shown here is the output from another regression model where the outcome this time is the likelihood of being a repeat victim. And again, disability and disability type are included as explanatory variables along with a large number of other factors that may be related to the risk of re-victimisation. In this case, your adjusted odds ratio greater than 1 means that the victim or incident with that characteristic is more likely to be a repeat victim, and an adjusted odds ratio less than 1, so to the left of your dotted line on the screen, means that they are less likely to be a repeat victim. So this model just confirms that people with disability were significantly more likely to experience violent re-victimisation compared with those with no disability identified, even after we adjust for all other relevant factors. Generally, those with cognitive and or psychosocial disabilities are at significantly greater risk of re-victimisation than those with other types of disabilities or no known disability. So there's a lot of figures and a lot of data that we looked at. So I'm going to briefly summarise our results in relation to the 2 questions that we initially posed. So question 1, what proportion of people with disability are victims of crime? We found that of all people with disability in New South Wales, 17% were a victim of any type of crime, 7% were a victim of violent crime, and 4% were a victim of domestic violence related crime. We found that individuals with certain types of disability were more likely to experience violent and DV related crime than others, particularly those with cognitive and psychosocial disorders. Females and young people with disability were found to be particularly vulnerable. This was especially true for Aboriginal women. For example, the odds of a female Aboriginal person with a disability experiencing a domestic violence related crime were 4 times the odds of a male non-Aboriginal person with disability. While not presented here, increased rates of victimisation were also seen for those with prior contacts as a victim, as an offender, as an inmate, persons in need of protection on ADVOs, those with prior health and housing contacts, and those residing in more disadvantaged areas. So together, these findings highlight the complex compounding life circumstances that contribute to an increased vulnerability to crime. In relation to the second question, what proportion of victims of crime experience disability? So we found that people with disability comprised up to 18% of all victims of crime in New South Wales, up to 28% of all victims of violent crime, and up to 1/3 of all victims of DV-related crime. But again, Aboriginal people were overrepresented, with around 40% of all Aboriginal victims of crime being identified as having a disability. We also found that persons of interest were less likely to be proceeded against by police when incidents involve people with a disability, especially in relation to violent incidents. Differences in police action rates were particularly pronounced for those with both cognitive and physical disabilities. Now, there are many reasons why an offender may not be proceeded against, including that a person of interest may not have been identified in relation to that event. Police are also less likely to proceed against someone in matters where there's insufficient evidence, if the victim or their family are unwilling to proceed, if it's not considered in the public interest, or the complaint can be withdrawn. So we've suggested in the paper that future research should really consider whether better support during the prosecution process is needed for people with a disability who are victims of crime, but also for their families and advocates. We also found people with disability were more likely to experience violent and DV-related re-victimisation within 12 months compared with those with no disability identified, even after we took into account a range of other factors that might influence their risk of being a repeat victim. Generally, those with cognitive and or psychosocial disabilities were at greatest risk of re-victimisation. This finding again underscores the need for further protection and supports to be put in place for people with a disability who are coming into contact with the New South Wales criminal justice system. So as Stewart said, this paper has now been released and is available on our website, bocsar.newsouthwales.gov.au. And as Jackie said, this isn't really a first. It's the first time that we've been able to link New South Wales Police Force victim data with other state and Commonwealth data sets to identify whether a victim is a person with disability. This information isn't routinely available in any of our criminal justice data collections. So until now, we haven't really been able to answer these fundamental questions. So now, while our study is important in forming understanding of the intersection between disability and victimisation, we believe that the true value of linked administrative data sets in this field are yet to be fully realised. Providing the governance and infrastructure to facilitate access to these linked data sets is important. An ongoing commitment to the development of methods and resourcing of analytical expertise is also critical to the success of any future linked data assets, particularly in terms of contributing to changes in policy and practice and improving outcomes for people with a disability. Thank you, Jackie. That's all from me. I'll hand it back to you to take questions.
Yeah, I mean, that's an incredible figure, isn't it? That 1/3 of the domestic violence victims are people with disability. It's just a staggering volume. So I think we probably only have time for 2 questions, but we've got, so we're sorry to the people who we're not going to get to. A question here about the interaction of different disability types. So how have you allowed for the blending of these categories? So I guess people having multiple disability, falling in multiple disability categories. And I know you picked this up in the re-victimisation work, but what about in that base level of victimisation, Suzanne?
I'll probably let Stewart talk about that for the offending data, but yeah, certainly I didn't go into every category, but in there we have, when we talk about disability type, we have shown the rates for people who have just a cognitive or psychosocial or a physical disability only, but then we also look at those with psychosocial combinations of those disability types. So someone with a cognitive and psychosocial disability, someone with a cognitive and a physical disability, or someone with all three disability types. It is really difficult to get a handle on the types of disability people had from the data that we had available, particularly that psychosocial disability category, which you can see that they were more likely to be victims, and we find in the offender paper are more likely to be offenders. It wasn't clear from our data, because unfortunately it was aggregated. It wasn't clear what sort of conditions or disorders made up the largest proportion of those disability types. So that's certainly something that needs to be improved on, so we can get a better idea of who these people are that are experiencing victimisation and who are coming in contact with the criminal justice system as an offender more frequently.
Do you want to chime in? Covered? Happy to give Suzanne the tick of approval with her answer. That's high praise. Thanks, Suzanne. Now, this is a high-level question, but what are you hoping to come out of this research?
So look, for BOCSAR, this was really exciting work because, as you said, Jackie, we are often asked this question, and from the research that's been done with smaller studies, there's certainly been a belief that people with disability are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, and certainly need people are aware that they need more disability supports and services. But this is the first time we've been able to look not only at custodial samples, which we have quite a bit of information about in terms of disability, but right throughout the criminal justice system. We can look at people who are victims, but also people who are going through the courts and potentially be given non-custodial penalties. So we really wanted to answer some of those key questions that we've never been able to answer before. Obviously wanting to raise the awareness of the challenges that people with disability face. And look, also to highlight the value of having these large linked data assets and how important they can be in terms of improving our knowledge about experiences of people with disability, and as Stewart said, more importantly, monitoring whether those who are in need getting access to the services and supports that they need, and indeed whether those services and support are resulting in improved outcomes for people with disability. So that's sort of the next step, really, Jack. Okay,
fantastic. Look, hopefully things will just improve from here. But regardless, it really made a huge contribution in setting the foundations for that knowledge about this critical issue, and it's really come almost just in time with the Royal Commission being very interested in these results, and also the Close the Gap work pervades all of those Close the Gap measures that we're working with in justice about disability. So it's really, if we hadn't had this work, it was we'd have it be in a terrible position. Okay, look, that brings us to a close. So thanks everybody for your time today. Really loved sharing this work with you. Keep an eye out for future BOCSAR events. There's always something new on the horizon. But otherwise, try and stay dry and have a good day. Thanks so much, folks.